Welcome true crime enthusiasts to today's case. Supposed to be a joyous occasion, Areti and Dimitros Koularmanis, a young couple with 3 small children, had traveled from their Toronto home to New York City for a family reunion. Eager to reunite with relatives and share quality time, they had rented a ground-floor apartment in Jamaica, Queens, to stay with Dimitros' parents. Areti, a 23-year-old Greek-Canadian, had met Dimitrios, a Greek immigrant and carpenter, in Toronto. They fell in love, got married, and started a family, blissfully unaware that their happiness would soon be shattered by a brutal act of violence. On September 19, 1970, after a tiring day, they retired early to bed. Unaware that a criminal, Joseph Baldi, was lurking outside, they had no reason to suspect danger. Baldi, a career criminal, had targeted the Koularmanis' apartment after noticing the slightly ajar window. Seizing the opportunity, he quietly entered their dark bedroom. As Areti and Dimitros slept, Baldi hoped to find valuables to steal without waking them. However, Areti sensed his presence, opening her eyes to a shadowy figure standing over her. Terrified, she screamed and tried to push him away, reaching for her still-asleep husband. Panicking, Baldi realized he had to silence Areti before she alerted the entire house. Drawing a knife he had brought, he stabbed her in the throat, causing a sharp pain and a gush of blood. Areti, stumbling out of bed, staggered towards the door in an attempt to seek help. Managing to wake Dimitrios, he witnessed her bleeding profusely and grasped the gravity of the situation. Dimitrios' screams for help brought his parents and children rushing to the scene. Finding Areti on the floor, gasping for breath, they called for an ambulance and tried to stem the bleeding. Tragically, it was too late. Areti had lost too much blood, and her life slipped away. Rushed to Mary Immaculate Hospital, she was pronounced dead on arrival. In the darkness, Baldi had escaped, leaving behind a trail of blood and a shattered family. The room revealed missing jewelry and money, pointing to a motive of silencing a witness. The police launched an extensive manhunt, but with no leads, witnesses, fingerprints, or clues, Baldi vanished without a trace, leaving the Koularmanis family haunted by an unsolved mystery. After Areti's death, Dimitrios returned to Toronto with his children, eventually remarrying and becoming a priest in the Greek Orthodox Church. Dr. Anastasios Koularmanis, one of their children, now serves as the director of Greek education for the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. For nearly 2 years, the Areti case remained an unsolved mystery, with the police lacking leads, suspects, and motives. The killer, leaving no trace except the victim's blood, kept the Koularmanis family hoping for eventual justice. However, their suffering was not isolated, as another family in the same neighborhood experienced a tragedy at the hands of the same man. On the night of March 19, 1972, the killer targeted another ground-floor apartment in Jamaica, Queens, reminiscent of the scene where Areti had been murdered. Observing an open window in one of the bedrooms, he waited until the lights were off, then entered the small room. Inside, a teenage girl, Camille Perniola, a 17-year-old high school student, and her 7-year-old brother, Marco, slept in separate beds. Camille, a bright and popular girl with a promising future, became the killer's next prey. Baldi approached her bed, raising his knife and plunging it into her chest, taking her life instantly. Without showing any concern for Camille's life or the impact on her family, Baldi rifled through her room, taking jewelry and money before escaping through the window. Unbeknownst to him, Marco slept through the entire ordeal, spared from the horror but not from the subsequent grief. As Baldi vanished into the night, he left behind another lifeless body, a new mystery, and an additional nightmare. The following day, Armando Perniola, Camille and Marco's father, discovered the horrifying sight when he went to wake them up. Opening the door, he found his daughter, his pride and joy, lying dead in her bed, covered in blood, while his son remained asleep. Oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded, upon discovering Camille's lifeless body, Armando screamed and collapsed in disbelief, unable to comprehend or accept the tragedy. Maria, rushing to the scene, fainted at the sight. Marco, waking up to the shocking reality, cried out for his sister, bewildered and unsure of what to do. The arriving police confirmed that Camille fell victim to the same man who had killed Areti. Recognizing the familiar pattern of the knife wound, window entry, and robbery, realizing they were dealing with a serial killer, they pledged to capture him, bring justice, and protect the public from further harm, hoping for a breakthrough to end the reign of terror. However, Joseph Baldi showed no signs of halting his malevolent spree. Less than 4 weeks after Camille's death, he struck again in the same Queens neighborhood. This time, his target was Clara Toriello, a 21-year-old blonde secretary engaged to marry a New York City police officer. Unaware of the impending horror, Clara's life took a horrific turn on the morning of April 13th, around 7 a.m. When her sister entered Clara's room to wake her for work, a scream echoed through the apartment. On the bed lay Clara's lifeless body, covered in blood. She had suffered 4 stab wounds to the neck and back, the force of which pierced her heart and lungs. The killer, leaving only the plastic cap of an electric hair dryer next to her buzzing head, had torn off her bra and panties after the gruesome act. Clara's wide-open eyes stared at the ceiling in terror, leaving another community devastated by the actions of a merciless murderer. Upon arriving, the police swiftly cordoned off the crime scene, realizing that this was the work of the same maniac responsible for 2 other women's murders in March. The modus operandi was identical, entering Clara's ground floor room through an open window, waiting until she was asleep, and attacking her with a pre-brought knife. Interestingly, he didn't take anything from her, not even her engagement ring. News of the 3rd murder sent shockwaves through the borough, and the perpetrator, dubbed the Queens Creeper by the media, became the most feared and hated figure in Queens. More than 50 detectives were assigned to the case, yet they faced a daunting challenge with no leads, clues, or suspects. Dealing with a seemingly elusive and invisible enemy, they confronted a ghost, a phantom, a monster. The people of Queens lived in constant fear and paranoia. Women avoided going out alone, especially at night. Backyards featured big dogs trained to bark at strangers. Doors and windows were locked. Alarms and cameras were installed, and guns and pepper spray were purchased. Sleeping with one eye open, listening for any indication of an intruder, became the norm. Some even relocated, hoping to escape the nightmare. Spring became a time of fear and dread for the women of Queens. The night slasher remained at large, with uncertainty about when or where he would strike next. A silent fiend, a shadow in the dark, a knife in the night. He preyed on unsuspecting women, leaving their windows open for a breeze in the warm weather. Entering their homes, creeping into their bedrooms, he stabbed them to death in their sleep, leaving no trace, evidence, or motive. He became a mystery, a nightmare, a legend. Not all of the night prowler's attacks were successful. Sometimes, he encountered resistance, was interrupted by noise, or scared away by light. In one instance, a woman narrowly escaped his clutches. As she slept with her husband in their 2nd-floor apartment, she felt a cold draft on her face, opening her eyes to a horrifying sight. A man's arm and a hand, wielding a long-bladed knife, reaching through the window inches from her throat. Her piercing scream woke her husband, startling the intruder, who quickly withdrew his arm, and the window slammed shut. The nightmare persisted as another young girl fell victim to the night prowler terrorizing Queens for 2 years. Another family faced devastation from a senseless and savage murder, deepening the fear and frustration for both the police and the public. On June 18, 1972, the Daily News headline screamed the horror: "Night Prowler Kills 4th Queens Girl." The story recounted the chilling details of the latest attack that occurred in the early hours of that morning. John and Angeline Januszko were peacefully sleeping in their ground floor apartment in Jamaica, Queens, when they were jolted awake by a piercing scream. It was their daughter, Debbie, 15, who had been sleeping in the next room. Rushing to her aid, they found her sitting upright in bed, clutching her chest, blood spilling from a deep wound in her heart. With terror and pain in her eyes, she uttered her last words: "He stabbed me." He put his hand in through the window. Then she collapsed, losing consciousness and never waking up again. The killer had utilized a metal milk box to reach through the slightly open window, which allowed in some fresh air, and without seeing Debbie's face, he mercilessly plunged his knife into her chest, taking her life in cold blood without any discernible motive or remorse. The police found themselves perplexed by the case. While they had gathered partial fingerprints from the window sills at the crime scenes, they were too smudged and incomplete to match with any suspect. Lacking other evidence, motives, patterns, or witnesses, the only consistent element was the killer's signature, a slashed bra left behind at each murder, either cut from the victim's body or stolen from a nearby clothesline. The murderer displayed a twisted obsession with this female undergarment, a fetish driving him to commit heinous acts. An investigator expressed the sentiment, saying, "He's a sicko, a pervert, a monster, and we have no idea who he is or where he'll strike next." The brutal murder of Januszko deeply shook the city, as the young woman endured 17 stab wounds in her own apartment, leaving a scene of unimaginable horror. Desperation consumed the police as they sought the elusive killer, who had evaded them for 4 days. On June 21st, a stroke of luck occurred. 2 detectives patrolling the neighborhood noticed a tall, skinny man lurking in the shadows. He matched the sketch provided by several girls who had reported seeing him following them. The detectives decided to approach him and ask questions. This man was Joseph Baldi, a living nightmare at 31 years old, appearing much older with a gaunt face, sunken eyes, and greasy hair. Living on welfare in a rundown rooming house just blocks away from where Januszko and 2 other women had been killed in the past month. Baldi had a low IQ of 79, a history of mental illness and violence, and had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals since 1962. Diagnosed with schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. His extensive criminal record included charges of assault, robbery, and rape, painting a portrait of a predatory individual with a disturbing taste for young women. The detectives conducted a search of Joseph Baldi's room, revealing a chilling collection of evidence. Various knives, stained with blood, were found alongside a loaded and ready-to-fire gun. Pornographic magazines featuring women resembling his victims were scattered, along with a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings detailing the murders he had committed, kept as trophies and reminders of his twisted fantasies. While the police had successfully apprehended the killer, their investigation uncovered a shocking scandal. Joseph Baldi, a dangerous individual, should not have been on the streets, but rather confined in a secure facility to prevent harm to others. However, a series of bureaucratic blunders and miscommunications had allowed him to evade proper containment. Reported as a breakdown in communication between the courts, the state mental hospital system, 2 district attorneys' offices, and law enforcement agencies, Baldi had exploited the system's loopholes and flaws, leading to his release multiple times despite being deemed dangerous and unfit for society. The system's failure had allowed this monster to roam freely and claim lives. Despite the night slasher's reign of terror, the tide was about to turn. On the night of September 5, 1971, he broke into another Queens apartment in search of a victim. Fortunately, no life was taken this time. After taking what he needed to steal, he left, but the authorities were closing in on him. The residents promptly alerted the police about the burglary, and law enforcement arrived almost immediately. Surrounding the building, they commenced a search for the intruder. Ultimately, they found him attempting to escape on the fire escape. Despite orders to stop and surrender, he refused and, instead, pulled out a gun, firing a shot at one of the officers in an attempt to kill. Fortunately, the shot missed, and in a desperate bid to escape, he tried to return to the apartment but found himself trapped. With all exits blocked by the police, he realized he was caught. Discarding his gun, he surrendered, allowing the police to storm into the apartment, arrest him, handcuff him, and drag him out of the building. Transported to the station, he faced charges for burglary, attempted murder, and 4 counts of homicide. However, it became apparent that he was not a typical criminal. He exhibited signs of madness. Devoid of remorse or emotion, he spoke incoherently, rambled about voices, and displayed maniacal laughter. Recognizing his extreme danger, the police determined he couldn't be held in a regular jail and opted to send him to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation and treatment. Joseph Baldi was transferred to the Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Hospital, where he received a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. Despite medication and therapy, he showed no improvement, remaining violent, delusional, and unpredictable. His threat to both himself and others led to a decision in November to relocate him to the Creedmoor State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. On December 23, 1971, a grand jury in Queens reviewed the evidence against Joseph Baldi and determined that he should stand trial for attempted murder due to the serious charge of shooting at a police officer. The grand jury issued an indictment, a formal charge against him, and sent a notice of the indictment to the Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Hospital where he was supposed to be held. The expectation was that he would be transferred to a court in Queens to face justice. However, a critical error occurred. The notice of the indictment never reached its intended destination. Whether lost, misplaced, forgotten, or deliberately ignored, it became buried under paperwork, discarded, or taken by unknown hands. The fate of the document remained a mystery, and as a result, the Creedmoor State Hospital, where Baldi was incarcerated, had no knowledge of his pending legal troubles. Hospital officials believed he was a patient with paranoid schizophrenia who had shown improvement through medication and treatment, thinking he was ready for release to rejoin society. Their assumption proved to be tragically wrong. On January 21, 1972, a fatal mistake was made. The hospital released the night slasher without notifying the police, informing the public, or warning the families of his victims. Baldi was given a bus ticket, a few dollars, a pat on the back, and well wishes for good luck. He was set free without any public awareness or alert, unleashing a monster back into society. The Queen's Creeper wasted no time upon his release. Pent up for too long, deprived of his passion, obsession, and addiction, he had been dreaming of killing, slashing, and bleeding. Waiting for his chance, his opportunity, his moment had finally arrived. Returning to Queens, his old hunting ground, he sought out open windows, sleeping women, and easy targets. Attacking them with brutal stabbings and slashings, he killed and took their bras, resuming his horrifying spree. However, his reign of terror was short-lived as he was arrested once again. In the interrogation room, the suspect displayed a state of confusion and terror. Staring blankly at the wall, he would suddenly snap out of it, recounting gruesome details of the killings, as if reliving them in his mind. Frantically gesturing and mimicking the motions of stabbing and slashing, he pointed to locations of the bodies and bloodstains at the Januszko house, where he had brutally murdered four members of the same family. According to court documents, confessing to the detectives, he expressed horror, repeatedly saying, "I think I hurt a girl. I cut her," as if grappling to make sense of his actions. Despite his attorneys filing appeals, arguing that Baldi was too mentally ill to understand his actions and deserving of treatment rather than punishment, their efforts proved futile. The appeals failed one by one, and Baldi remained locked up in his cell, where he belonged. In 1997, Baldi had an opportunity for parole, a chance to plead his case before the board. He could have expressed remorse, claimed transformation, and asserted readiness to reintegrate into society. However, he chose silence, sitting there with a blank expression, seemingly indifferent. Unimpressed, the parole board deemed his release incompatible with the welfare and safety of the community. They maintained that he remained a danger, a threat, a killer. Consequently, his parole was denied, and he was sent back to his cell, where he would remain until his death. That day arrived in 2009 when Baldi drew his last breath. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.